Okay, so in this video I'm going to go over two main aspects of skeletal muscle, and it's where the skeletal muscle gets its energy for movement or contraction, as well as what causes us to experience muscle fatigue. Okay, so I'm going to kind of walk down around this outside perimeter. This is all segments of how the muscles generate their energy. And then we'll go into the CORI cycle for a second to highlight what happens to lactate in the muscle. And then we'll finish out with the two main aspects of how a muscle experiences fatigue and why. Okay, so skeletal muscle uses ATP for energy, and ATP is a driving energy source for contraction and motion. So basically speaking, you know, if you're going to catch a glass off a table, or if you needed to jump high, or for a tennis serve, anything that requires those short bursts of energy, the skeletal muscle has free ATP available for that. And then beyond that, if you are going to sprint, like your dog gets loose and you have to go chase it, or you're chasing a bus, or you're just doing sprints for training, then the body can use creatine to recycle this free ATP. Now, to step back here and just go into what ATP is, it's adenosine triphosphate, and then the spent form of ATP, or ADP, is adenosine diphosphate. So ATP has 3-phosphate, ADP has 2. This is kind of the spent battery, and the ATP is the kind of the energy molecule. So creatine, with this phosphocreatine, it has a phosphate group that it can donate to ADP to recycle it to ATP, and then the creatine is obviously loses the phosphate group. So that's how creatine works for us in the skeletal muscle. It recycles free ATP faster for us. So we can do the weightlifting and we can do the sprints and stuff with the help of creatine. Okay, so those are the first two ways that the body, skeletal muscle, uses ATP for energy. Now, to get ATP, so anything beyond that, so a 200 to 400 meter race, we're actually going to start having to make our own ATP. And we do that in a process called glycolysis. And now I go over that in my mitochondria one-part video, but glycolysis is basically taking glucose and generating ATP. I didn't highlight it here, but between the glucose and pyruvate, which is the end product, you generate ATP as part of the process. Now, muscle has the capacity to store glucose right in the skeletal muscle in the form of glycogen. Up to 2% of the skeletal muscle volume can actually be glycogen, which is stored glucose, so it's right there for the muscle to use immediately. Now, the only other areas in the body that really can store glycogen is the liver and the kidneys. So, like I said, between 200 and 400 meter race, you're going to kind of tap into that reserve of glucose as glycogen through glycolysis and break it down to ATP. Okay, so all these three ways that we generate and use ATP are done anaerobically. That means that we do not need oxygen. So a race that's beyond 500 meters and anything that's kind of a cardio workout, we're going to have to use oxygen at that point to generate ATP in a process called cellular respiration. Now, the pyruvate molecule from the glycolysis pathway, this pyruvate molecule actually goes into an organelle called the mitochondria, and it's inside the mitochondria that the skeletal muscle can create massive amounts of ATP relative to what I just showed you here. And I go into this in my mitochondria part 1 video if you want to learn more about that. So this process requires oxygen. It happens inside the mitochondria, and it yields a far greater amount of ATP than the other three options available at this point. The other three options available. Okay, so these four ways are the ways that skeletal muscle draws energy through ATP. Okay, so generally speaking, people believe that lactate buildup causes muscle fatigue. That's not really the case. To just show you what happens with lactate and how it's generated. So this is, once again, glycolysis. You start with glucose, and there's a bunch of reactions that happen between glucose and the end product pyruvate. And pyruvate, like I just mentioned, can enter into the mitochondria to help us produce more ATP. However, pyruvate can also be converted to lactate. Now, lactate is basic, and lactic acid is what's usually referred to as one of the markers for muscle fatigue. But lactate is actually exported from the muscle cell through something called the CORI cycle, and it's then brought to the liver, where the liver converts it back to glucose, and then to complete the CORI cycle, the glucose is reintroduced to the muscle tissue where it can be recycled, either converted back to glycogen or then converted back into pyruvate to make more ATP. What actually causes fatigue is not being able to manage the pH of the environment. Now here I put the pH of the skeletal muscle is at 7.0, which is roughly neutral. So exercise generates protons, and it's the protons that that can impact the fatigue of the muscle. That actually creates a condition of fatigue. And fatigue is actually the muscle keeping itself safe from cellular suicide. It's actually a survival mechanism for the skeletal muscle, because if you keep exercising beyond the muscle's capacity, it will kill itself. So we actually become fatigued by a buildup of protons, and it's not that we've used all our energy, because there is still glycogen in the muscle for energy. It's the fact that we generate too many protons and we throw our pH of the environment into an acidic condition. Now, pH is critical for enzymatic function. So enzymes need a very tight pH for them to function correctly, which are behind, it's the enzymes that are behind all of these processes. So as you can see here, the pH of the skeletal muscle is 7.0, but inside the mitochondria, where we generate the lion's share of ATP and energy, the pH is actually 7.8 in one compartment and up to 7.4 in the other. So keeping the acidic buildup is critical to prevent fatigue. And the other way that skeletal muscle can exhibit fatigue is a buildup of inorganic phosphate. Now, I already mentioned that ATP and ADP have 2 and 3 phosphates associated with the molecule respectively. Pardon me. So it's the buildup of inorganic phosphate from ATP utilization that can also induce a condition of fatigue. The inorganic phosphate then binds with calcium in this skeletal muscle, which forms a precipitate, and it's that precipitate that can actually induce a condition of fatigue. So to learn more about how the skeletal muscle uses calcium in contraction, you can watch my Skeletal Muscle, Science of Muscle Part 1, where I go over contraction and how calcium is used. So anyways, muscle energy and muscle fatigue are highlighted here with kind of a little bit of the CORI cycle, just a quick look at the CORI cycle. So in closing, make sure that you are doing what you need to do to keep your pH optimum, and it is not a lack of energy, generally speaking. It's actually an imbalance in environmental conditions.